Some words don't end a marriage the moment they are spoken. They begin ending the moment they are believed. Lawrence Hastings believed his wife's silence was a sign of a simple, eventless past. He did not know that judges in the highest international courts had once spent years rising to their feet whenever she entered a room. Winter rain dragged silver lines down the glass of the estate study. The room was a fortress of dark oak, imported leather, and the expensive stillness of inherited wealth. Despite the soft heat, the physical atmosphere felt remarkably cold. Lawrence paced the Persian rug, driven by the frantic energy of a man obsessed with his upward trajectory. In his right hand, he tapped the silver Gala invitation rhythmically against his palm. He spoke to the empty air rather than the woman sitting still by the window. The logistics merger is stalled. Lawrence projected like a courtroom litigator. Croft is threatening to file a motion for dismissal by Friday. If we lose the injunction, the firm loses the shipping accounts. Clara Vance remained perfectly still in the wingback chair. She did not interrupt. Her posture was impeccably straight, her hands resting lightly on the wool fabric of her dark skirt. Lawrence stopped pacing, glancing toward Clara with the dismissive affection reserved for a decorative fixture. "But I should not burden you with this," he said, waving the embossed card. "You would not understand the tactical maneuvers. Corporate arbitration is not something you can just pick up." She looked at him. Her expression did not change. "Just make sure your dress for tomorrow night fits the firm's aesthetic," he continued, turning to the legal files on his mahogany desk. "The gala is critical. Judge Sterling will be there. Leave the heavy legal strategy to those of us with actual courtroom experience." From where she sat, Clara read the upside-down text on his legal briefs. Her mind instantly cataloged the precedents, statutes, and glaring structural weaknesses in his argument. She offered no defense, nor did she list her credentials. She allowed the silence to stretch across the room. "I will make sure the evening goes smoothly," Clara said, her tone devoid of anger. "People often mistake politeness for peace. They are not the same thing." Lawrence nodded, already losing interest. Tossing the invitation onto the desk, he adjusted his cufflinks and walked out. He always had calls to make. The door clicked shut. Clara was alone. The study settled into profound emptiness, filled only by the winter storm against the glass. Clara stood up slowly. She walked to the oversized desk, looking down at the glowing computer screen. The cursor blinked at the end of a convoluted paragraph regarding international shipping jurisdiction. Beside the monitor lay a stack of printed depositions and a draft of his motion to dismiss. Clara traced the text on his screen. She read the argument Lawrence had spent 3 weeks agonizing over. It was also fundamentally flawed. He was relying on a domestic trade statute quietly superseded by a global maritime ruling 4 years prior. Opposing counsel would tear it apart in 10 minutes. Clara smiled with melancholic clarity. It was the exact jurisdictional overlap she had personally resolved during a historic tribunal session in Geneva a decade ago. She turned away and opened the console table drawer, retrieving a modest, dark object, the leather-bound notebook. Its edges were worn soft from international travel, the pages filled with dense records of constitutional precedents and legal insights from prosecuting corporate crimes on a global stage. It contained the architecture of a brilliant legal mind, perfectly hidden inside a house that only valued her ability to host dinner parties. Clara carried the book back to the desk, opened it, and picked up a heavy silver pen Lawrence had left behind. With calm strokes, she wrote down the exact corrective citation, the ruling, and the specific clause that invalidated his strategy. She left no sticky note on his keyboard, no helpful memo to save his reputation from public embarrassment. She wrote it solely for herself. She capped the pen. She closed the dark blue journal. The heavy thud sounded like a lock turning on a vault. Clara looked at the embossed silver invitation, promising an evening of elite networking. She smoothed her hand over her private journal. She would attend his gala. She would wear the conservative dress he requested. She would stand politely by his side. But she would no longer carry the weight of his world. The withdrawal began the following morning, in the exact moment when maintaining an illusion became more exhausting than facing the reality. The kitchen of the Hastings estate was a masterpiece of modern, affluent design. Sweeping expanses of white Carrara marble and floor-to-soiling windows framed the frozen, silver landscape of a late winter morning. It possessed all the warmth of an empty corporate lobby. For 3 years, Clara had served as the unseen pulse of this space. The dark roast coffee beans were always ground at exactly 6:30. The French press was left to steep so it was ready the exact second Lawrence descended the main staircase. It was an intricate, invisible architecture of daily care, constructed so flawlessly that her husband believed it simply manifested on its own. Today, that architecture collapsed. Clara stood motionless before the stainless steel sink. The water ran in a thin, measured stream, steam curling against the chilled window panes. In her hands, she held the porcelain mug, the simple white cup she favored for her tea. She washed it with slow, rhythmic precision. The sponge circled the delicate ceramic rim, the movement steady, deliberate, and entirely focused. Just inches away on the pristine marble counter sat Lawrence's empty coffee cup from the previous night. A dried ring of espresso stained the bottom of the glass. Usually, Clara would have rinsed it and begun brewing his morning blend, anticipating his needs before he even articulated them. This morning, she did not reach for it. She rinsed the delicate ceramic under the hot water, letting the warmth soak into her skin. Then, with a firm, decisive motion, she turned the mug upside down and placed it on the drying rack. It made a sharp click against the rubber matting. Lawrence's dirty cup remained untouched beside the sink. She left his mess exactly where he had abandoned it. Her warmth remained exactly the same. It simply no longer belonged to him by default. She dried her hands on a crisp linen towel, folding it into a perfect symmetrical square before laying it gently on the counter. The silence in the kitchen was profound. It was the calm, heavy quiet of a boundary being drawn in stone. Footsteps echoed against the hardwood floor. Lawrence entered the kitchen, rigid with the self-important urgency of a man who believed his schedule dictated the rotation of the earth. He was dressed in a tailored suit, his fingers habitually adjusting the silver cufflink at his wrist. He paused at the edge of the kitchen island, his eyes scanning the empty espresso machine. A brief flicker of confusion crossed his features, quickly replaced by a sigh of patronizing impatience. He looked at the dirty cup still sitting by the sink, then at his wife. "Are we forgetting our basic routines this morning?" Lawrence asked, his tone laced with condescending patience. "I have back-to-back mediations before the gala tonight. I don't have time to navigate a disorganized kitchen." Clara did not flinch. She had just poured a measure of hot water and fresh lemon into her newly washed white cup. She stood on the opposite side of the marble island, the wide, cold slab of stone serving as a physical barrier between them. Instead of apologizing or rushing to grind the beans, she lifted her drink. She held the mug with a firm, balanced two-handed grip. It was a highly specific posture. Her shoulders were relaxed, her spine straight, her chin level. Years ago, in the echoing halls of international tribunals, she had sat exactly like this. She had held a pen with this identical, unwavering composure while staring down hostile defense attorneys. It was the stance of an elite prosecutor, analyzing every weakness in the room while offering nothing to the opposition. "I am quite organized, Lawrence," Clara replied, her voice even and devoid of any sharp defensive edge. He scoffed, pulling his phone from his pocket to scroll through emails. "You've been distracted since yesterday. If maintaining the house is too complicated, we can hire staff. But tonight is the Legal Association Winter Gala. Half the appellate bench will be there. I need you focused. Try not to let your mind wander into whatever daydreams are keeping you so quiet." He mistook her stillness for submission. Men like him often confused politeness with peace, failing to realize that one was a social grace, while the other was a quiet surrender. He interpreted her physical calm as a lack of intellectual depth, assuming her thoughts were consumed by trivial domestic worries. He could not read the predatory patience resting behind her eyes. "I will be perfectly focused tonight," Clara said, taking a slow sip from her warm drink. The steam rose, partially obscuring her calm expression. Lawrence did not hear the warning. He merely grunted, grabbing his leather briefcase and abandoning the kitchen to buy coffee on his way to the firm. The heavy front door clicked shut, leaving the house in complete stillness. Clara remained standing at the marble island, her grip on the mug steady. She had offered no argument, no justification, and no tears. Silence was not an absence of power. It was an unbreachable shield, and she was content to let him exhaust his arrogance against it. When evening arrived, the master dressing room doors remained half open, letting harsh, geometric light spill across the floor. Lawrence stood before the trifold mirror, his expression locked in a tight, calculating frown. He adjusted the pristine cuffs of his tailored tuxedo, his movements sharp and restless. The air was heavy with the scent of cedar and expensive cologne, masking the underlying tension of the evening. Resting in the center of the dark marble vanity was the silver Gala invitation. It was a thick, heavy card stamped with the crest of the city's most exclusive legal association. To Lawrence, that embossed paper was not merely an admission ticket. It was a weapon. It was physical proof that his mid-tier firm had finally secured a seat among the elite architects of the law. Clara stood near the frosted window, fastening the clasp of a simple pearl necklace. She wore a floor-length gown in deep muted navy, deliberately chosen to avoid drawing attention. She had spent the last hour ensuring his shirt was perfectly pressed and the driver was scheduled to the minute, managing the invisible logistics of his ambition. He had not noticed. His gaze caught her reflection, and he turned to evaluate her. His eyes swept over her posture with the clinical precision of an auditor examining an asset ledger. "Keep it simple tonight," Lawrence instructed, his voice slicing through the quiet space. He picked up the heavy ticket, tapping its rigid edge rhythmically against his palm. "There will be senior appellate judges present, men who have spent decades analyzing the weight of every syllable spoken to them. I need to make a flawless impression." Clara lowered her hands. She met his gaze in the mirror, her expression perfectly composed. "I will not disrupt your networking, Lawrence." He crossed the room, the heels of his leather shoes clicking sharply. He stopped directly in front of her, his ambition radiating like nervous heat. Reaching out, he adjusted the dark lapel of her evening coat. The touch lacked any trace of warmth. He smoothed the fabric with a firm, correcting pressure. He straightened her collar with the meticulous, heavy-handed authority of a warden inspecting a prisoner before a public hearing. "Just stay close and smile politely," he continued, his tone dropping into a patronizing register that left no room for debate. "If any of the senior partners ask, just mention the charity boards. Do not try to engage them on policy. The judicial world is incredibly insular. They do not have the patience for civilian commentary." Clara looked down at his hands resting heavily on her shoulders. The weight of his arrogance was almost tangible. He had spent years carefully constructing a version of her in his mind, a quiet, uncomplicated woman whose world extended no further than the edge of his own shadow. "I understand perfectly," she replied, holding his gaze in the glass. She raised no objection, letting his words hang in the cold air, knowing that truth rarely needed to scream to prove its existence. Lawrence gave her collar one final tug, entirely satisfied with his own dominance. He slipped the formal invite into his inner pocket and checked his watch. "Good," he said, turning his back. "The car is waiting. Let us go." The drive to the city center passed in oppressive silence, broken only by the rhythmic hum of tires against wet pavement. Outside the tinted windows, a harsh winter storm had descended. Dark, swirling snow fell in thick sheets, burying the streets under freezing white. The cold weather mirrored the distance between them in the back seat. Lawrence spent the commute staring at his phone, silently rehearsing his introductory speeches, completely ignoring the woman sitting inches away. When the town car pulled up to the sweeping stone steps of the Grand Museum of Fine Arts, the atmosphere shifted. The historic building stood like a fortress of intellect and power. Massive granite columns reached toward a Gothic roof, while warm, golden light poured from the tall arched windows, cutting through the biting snow. A valet opened the door, and the freezing wind immediately bit through Clara's coat. She stepped out onto the damp pavement, her heels clicking against the stone. Lawrence marched ahead, driven by the immediate need to secure his social footing. He did not offer his arm. He did not look back to ensure she had navigated the icy stairs safely. Clara followed at her own measured pace, stepping through the heavy brass-handled doors and into the grand foyer. The transition was instantaneous. The chaotic storm vanished, replaced by the insulated warmth of the museum gallery. The soft, echoing sound of classical violin music drifted down from a mezzanine string quartet, weaving through the quiet murmurs of the state's most formidable legal minds. Waiters moved silently across polished marble floors, carrying trays of champagne beneath towering crystal chandeliers. Lawrence immediately scanned the room like a hawk, searching only for faces that could elevate his status. Clara, however, stopped near the entrance. She took a slow, deep breath. She looked up at the high vaulted ceilings, tracing the intricate historic frescoes that depicted the origins of international law. The scent of old paper, polished mahogany, and subtle perfume filled the air. For Lawrence, this room was a terrifying battlefield where he had to prove his worth. For Clara, it was something else entirely. Her shoulders, held in a state of quiet tension for days, finally relaxed. The tightness in her jaw softened. The museum did not intimidate her. The towering marble pillars and hushed, intellectual conversations felt like the walls of a childhood home. She recognized the rhythm of this space. She knew the unwritten rules of the quiet nods exchanged between appellate judges, the precise grips holding crystal glasses, and the silent language of power that hovered over the room. She had not merely visited this world, she had once helped build its foundations. The grand gallery of the museum thrummed with the low, calculated murmur of the city's legal elite. Crystal chandeliers cast fragmented light across the polished marble floors. Waiters moved silently through the crowd, carrying silver trays of champagne. The air smelled faintly of expensive cologne, old paper, and the sharp chill of the winter night outside. Lawrence adjusted his cuffs, his eyes scanning the room with the frantic hunger of a man desperate to belong. He did not notice the way his wife stood beside him. Her posture was perfectly aligned, her hands loosely holding a crystal flute of sparkling water. It was the stance of someone completely comfortable in a room full of predators. "Ah, Croft," Lawrence said, his voice adopting an artificial warmth. Richard Croft, a senior partner at a rival corporate firm, turned from his conversation. He was an older man with sharp eyes, the kind of lawyer who noticed everything left unsaid. He offered a polite nod as Lawrence approached, dragging Clara slightly behind him by the elbow. "Lawrence, good to see you," Croft said, his gaze naturally drifting to the woman standing beside the younger lawyer. "I don't believe we've had the pleasure." "This is my wife, Clara," her husband interrupted before she could speak. He patted her shoulder with a gesture that felt more like a dismissal than an introduction. "She's the anchor at home, keeps the estate running so I can handle the real battles." Croft offered a respectful smile. "A pleasure, Clara. Are you in the profession yourself?" Lawrence laughed. It was a loud, hollow sound that echoed awkwardly against the marble columns. "Oh, no. Clara prefers a simple life. She enjoys her quiet routines, organizing the calendar, and reading. The legal world is far too cutthroat for her gentle disposition. Isn't that right, darling?" She did not flush. She did not tighten her jaw. She simply held her glass with a calm, precise grip. Her index finger rested lightly against the rim. It was a subtle gesture, yet it carried the undeniable muscle memory of a woman accustomed to holding the attention of a high-stakes negotiation table. "I find the law has its own kind of poetry," Clara said. The younger man quickly waved his hand, dismissing her. "She reads a lot of history. Anyway, Richard, about the pending merger." As he aggressively steered the conversation back to his own firm's ambitions, Croft's sharp eyes lingered on her. He noticed the absolute stillness in her expression. Anger was loud. Frustration was loud. Her calm meant she had already placed the man exactly where he belonged in her mind. She took a slow, measured sip of her water, showing no sign of embarrassment. She simply let her husband's words hang in the air, allowing them to reveal his shallowness without requiring a single defense of her own. When her husband became fully absorbed in his self-promotional monologue, Clara stepped back, letting the heavy velvet curtains and the crowd swallow the sound of his voice. The museum's East Wing housed a temporary exhibition of historical legal documents. It was dimmer here, the lighting strictly controlled to preserve the centuries-old parchment. She drifted toward the centerpiece of the gallery, a massive glass case displaying an early draft of the state constitution. She stood before the glass, her eyes tracking the intricate script with practiced familiarity. "It's a bit difficult to read if you aren't used to the old calligraphy," a voice said. A young clerk, wearing an expression of eager overconfidence, stepped up beside her. He glanced at her, taking in her understated elegance, and clearly categorized her as a bored spouse waiting out the gala. "This is the foundational text for our state's property laws," the clerk explained, using the slow tone of a teacher addressing a novice. "Very dry stuff, honestly. Most people just look at the signature at the bottom." She did not interrupt. She let him finish his explanation, her expression remaining perfectly polite and attentive. A courteous demeanor is frequently misinterpreted as passive submission, though they bear no actual resemblance. "It is fascinating," she murmured, reaching out to trace a path inches above the protective glass. She stopped near the third paragraph. "Though I have always wondered about this specific phrasing regarding the coastal boundaries." The clerk chuckled. "Oh, the boundary lines? It just means the state owns the water up to a mile out." "Not exactly," she said, asking her question with the intellectual curiosity of a scholar. "The wording here explicitly references an older maritime treaty. If you apply the strict jurisdictional loophole established by the colonial admiralty courts, doesn't this clause technically leave the deepwater harbor unregulated during a state of war? Or has the recent appellate decision retroactively closed that gap?" The clerk stopped smiling. The condescension drained from his face, replaced by a rigid panic. He stared at the text, and then he stared at her. The terminology she had casually deployed was not found in a tourist brochure. It was the kind of devastatingly complex constitutional analysis reserved for Supreme Court litigators. Clara turned her head, offering him a soft, reassuring smile. She did not wait for an answer he clearly did not possess. "It is a beautiful document, either way," she murmured. Leaving the young man completely frozen, she turned away. She walked back toward the main gallery, her footsteps silent against the marble, moving with the effortless grace of a woman who had nothing left to prove. Just as she rejoined the crowd, the heavy, oak-paneled doors at the far end of the Grand Museum's main gallery swung open. The subtle shift in the room's atmosphere was immediate, rippling through the sea of tailored suits and silk evening gowns like a sudden drop in barometric pressure. The gentle strains of the string quartet continued to float above the gathered elite. Below it, the low hum of networking, the clinking of champagne flutes, and the quiet murmurs of corporate strategy abruptly died down. Retired Supreme Court Judge Arthur Sterling stepped over the marble threshold. His silver hair sat immaculate above a dark tuxedo draped perfectly over a rigid frame. He carried the weight of decades spent making historic rulings on international tribunals. His expression remained an unreadable mask of judicial distance. The crowd parted naturally, offering him a wide, respectful berth. Lawrence Hastings did not step back. His pulse quickened against his stiff collar. This was the exact moment he had built his entire evening around. He had prepared the precise phrasing he would use to pivot a casual introduction into a lucrative meeting. A single nod of approval from Sterling could secure the pending corporate merger Lawrence had been failing to close. He glanced back briefly to ensure Clara was safely out of his way. She was still standing quietly near the historical exhibits. Satisfied that she would not interrupt or embarrass him, Lawrence launched himself into the current of the crowd. He adjusted his silk tie with damp, trembling fingers. He squeezed past two senior partners from a rival firm, offering a tight, unapologetic smile as he shoved his way to the front. The air in the gallery was cool, heavily scented with expensive perfume and the faint aroma of archived paper. Yet, Lawrence felt a bead of sweat trace a slow line down his spine. His polished leather shoes clicked sharply against the marble as he positioned himself perfectly in Sterling's path. He practiced his smile, testing a carefully calibrated expression of confidence and deference. He raised his chin, adjusting the angle of his shoulders to project absolute certainty. He extended his right hand, the gold cufflink flashing under the chandeliers, ready to claim his place among the untouchable elite. Judge Sterling advanced slowly across the polished floor. His cold gaze swept over the assembled sycophants and attorneys with practiced indifference. He did not look at the outstretched hands appearing at the edge of his periphery. Lawrence stood directly in the center of the aisle, holding his bright, rehearsed smile. He planted his feet, ensuring his posture was impeccably straight. "Judge Sterling," he began, his voice slightly too loud for the hushed reverence of the gallery. "Lawrence Hastings. It is an absolute honor to." Sterling did not stop. He did not blink. He simply kept walking. The retired judge moved past Lawrence so closely that the heavy fabric of his sleeve brushed against the younger man's extended hand. Lawrence was left frozen in mid-sentence. The air seemed to vanish from his lungs. His hand hung suspended in the empty space, an artifact of ignored ambition. His carefully constructed smile cracked, falling away into a slack expression of genuine confusion. Sterling's stern face had suddenly transformed. The cold judicial distance melted, replaced by a wide, genuine, and profoundly respectful smile. He was not looking at Lawrence. He was looking at the woman standing a few feet away, illuminated by the soft glow of the display cases. Clara was holding her crystal flute with the calm, precise grip of a seasoned negotiator. She had not moved to introduce herself. She had simply turned her head, her dark eyes meeting the judge's gaze with a steady, equal calm. The entire gallery seemed to hold its breath as the towering legal icon stopped squarely in front of Clara. He did not offer his hand for a casual shake. Instead, Judge Sterling planted his feet, lowered his chin, and performed a formal old-world bow. It was a gesture of absolute deference that no one in the room had ever seen him give to anyone. Madam Prosecutor Vance. Sterling's deep voice echoed clearly through the sudden silence of the museum. What an unexpected and profound honor. The international courts have felt entirely empty since you stepped away. Lawrence's heart slammed against his ribs. The words made no sense. He stared at his wife's back, his mind scrambling to process the impossible title. Madam Prosecutor, the syllables hung in the cold, opulent air, heavy and irrefutable. Clara smiled. It was a soft, composed expression that held more natural authority than Lawrence had ever managed to project in his entire life. She did not look at her husband. She retained her inherent gentleness, but it was no longer a resource he was permitted to claim. Arthur, Clara replied, her voice smooth and perfectly measured. It has been a long time. You are looking well. Not as well as the woman who drafted the precedents we still rely on today, Sterling said, his tone carrying a reverence that bordered on awe. The surrounding crowd of elite lawyers stared in stunned fascination. The social ladder Lawrence had spent years trying to climb had just dissolved into nothing. The most powerful man in the room was standing with his head bowed to the quiet woman Lawrence had told to stay out of the way. Lawrence slowly lowered his empty hand. The museum's crystal chandeliers seemed to glare down at him, illuminating the exact depth of his ignorance. He was standing on the outside of a circle he had never even realized existed, watching his wife command the absolute respect of a world he could not touch. The classical violin music, drifting from the upper balcony, seemed to fade into a distant hum as Arthur Sterling continued to speak. The retired judge did not lower his voice. He possessed the natural projection of a man accustomed to being listened to in the highest constitutional courts of the world. Around them, the ambient chatter of the city's legal elite began to quiet. Senior partners and corporate power brokers, noticing the specific angle of Sterling's bow and the deep reverence in his posture, began to drift closer. I have taught at the university for 3 decades, Sterling said, his tone carrying the undeniable weight of historical record, and I still use your briefs as the absolute standard for international corporate prosecution. The way you dismantled the offshore routing structures during the Geneva tribunal. It was nothing short of architectural. Clara offered a graceful incline of her head. She did not display the desperate gratitude that Lawrence habitually exhibited whenever a superior acknowledged his existence. She stood there in her simple dark gown, holding her crystal water glass with the relaxed, precise grip of a woman who had once held the fate of global conglomerates in her hands. The ice in her glass barely shifted, betraying no tremor of need for validation. "You are too generous, Your Honor," Clara murmured, her voice steady. "I merely followed the paper trail to its constitutional end. The laws were already written. I only asked the court to read them." "Humility!" Sterling chuckled. He turned slightly, allowing the gathering crowd of attorneys to hear him. "She calls it following a paper trail. I call it cornering a syndicate that had successfully evaded 3 sovereign governments." He looked back at Clara, his eyes entirely sincere. "I was sitting in the gallery during your opening statement at the tribunal. You spoke for 45 minutes without looking at a single note. You laid out a web of systemic fraud with such moral clarity that when you finally finished speaking," Sterling paused, letting the memory settle over the cold marble floor. "When you finished, Counselor, the entire international court rose to their feet, in absolute silence. A heavy, reverent murmur rippled through the gathered lawyers. Richard Croft, the senior partner Lawrence, had been desperately trying to impress, stared at Clara with unblinking eyes. The realization of who she was, the legendary prosecutor whose maiden name was whispered with awe in constitutional law seminars, washed over the crowd. Lawrence stood frozen, his polished shoes seemingly rooted to the stone. He had told her to leave legal strategy to those with actual courtroom experience. Now, the most respected jurist in the room was describing how the world's highest judges had stood in silent respect for the very woman Lawrence had patronizingly told to organize his social calendar. The circle of elite attorneys naturally shifted, their bodies turning toward Clara, subtly adjusting the physical geography of the room. In the process, Lawrence was pushed toward the outer edge of the conversation. Nobody had intentionally shoved him. They simply gravitated toward the true center of intellectual gravity, treating him as a secondary fixture in his own marriage. Judge Sterling, oblivious to the domestic fracture he had just exposed, turned his attention to Lawrence. The older man smiled warmly, his expression filled with the genuine assumption that any man married to Clara Vance must possess a matching depth of character. "You must be tremendously proud, Mr. Hastings," Sterling said, his voice dropping into a register of collegial respect. "To share a home with a mind like hers, I can only imagine the caliber of conversations in your private library. It must be an incredible privilege to debate legal theory with the woman who set the precedent for transnational corporate accountability." Lawrence tried to speak. He ordered his lungs to draw breath and his facial muscles to form his standard networking smile, but his body violently refused to obey. The collar of his tailored tuxedo suddenly felt suffocatingly tight against his throat. His pulse hammered in his ears, a frantic panic that contrasted with the elegant calm of the museum's glass walls. He opened his mouth, but the only sound that escaped was a shallow intake of air. He managed a tight, dry nod, his jaw locked in rigid humiliation. The absolute agony of the moment did not come from a shouted insult. It arrived wrapped in the polite, unquestioning assumption of a peer who believed Lawrence actually respected his wife. Sterling assumed Lawrence knew her worth. Every sincere word of praise the judge offered was a mirror reflecting Lawrence's profound, arrogant blindness. He realized that while he had spent years boasting about minor regional settlements, the woman pouring his coffee had reshaped the architecture of global justice. Lawrence looked to his left. Croft was looking at him now, not with the admiration Lawrence craved, but with a sharp, calculating disbelief. The senior partner was silently wondering what kind of fool would hide a legal giant in his shadow and treat her like a decorative accessory. Slowly, Lawrence turned his eyes back to Clara. He expected to see the sharp, triumphant gleam of a woman who had just publicly defeated her dismissive husband. Instead, he saw nothing of the sort. Clara's expression was perfectly serene. She did not offer him a rescuing smile, nor did she twist the knife. She simply let the silence stretch across the cold marble, allowing him to stand completely alone in the exact center of his own ignorance. The circle closed. It happened without malice, driven entirely by the natural gravitational pull of genuine authority. Lawrence found himself stepping backward, his polished leather shoes slipping silently against the museum's marble floor. The bodies of senior partners, appellate judges, and seasoned litigators, men he had spent the last decade aggressively courting for a mere fraction of their time, shifted smoothly to form a tight, attentive ring around Clara. Croft, the senior corporate lawyer, who had barely acknowledged Lawrence an hour earlier with a patronizing nod, was now leaning forward, his posture rigid with rapt attention. Clara did not gloat. She did not cast a triumphant glance over her shoulder to ensure her husband was watching. She simply adjusted her hold on her crystal glass, her fingers resting lightly against the delicate rim, and met the eyes of her peers. The classical violin music, echoing faintly from the mezzanine above, seemed to lower in deference to her voice. It was a soft, measured tone, completely devoid of the performative volume Lawrence always deployed in boardrooms to assert dominance. Yet, it carried effortlessly over the hushed, expectant crowd. A question was raised by a visiting magistrate regarding a recent appellate decision on international corporate jurisdiction. The exact topic Lawrence had claimed was far too complex for her to grasp just that morning. Clara paused. She did not rush to fill the silence. When she spoke, she dissected the court's underlying rationale with surgical precision. She cited a foundational precedent, casually mentioning that she had drafted the initial arguments for it a decade prior in The Hague. There was no hesitation in her delivery, no need to consult notes or defer to a colleague. She spoke of constitutional architecture as if she had drawn the blueprints with her own hands. Lawrence stood entirely outside the circle. The crystal glass in his hand was empty. The ice had melted into a lukewarm puddle at the bottom, mirroring the quiet collapse of his own carefully constructed sense of superiority. He watched her profile. He watched Judge Sterling nod slowly, a gesture of profound professional respect that Lawrence had chased his entire career but never managed to elicit. A waiter passed, offering a silver tray of champagne flutes, but Lawrence did not move. He was realizing, with a cold, sinking clarity, that the woman he had instructed to manage his social calendar possessed an intellectual weight that eclipsed his entire firm. He was a man who built paper boats, standing before a woman who commanded the tide. Their departure from the Gala was a blur of polite nods and respectful murmurs, none of which were directed at the husband. The heavy glass doors of the Grand Museum of Fine Arts swung shut behind them, severing the warmth and the classical music. Outside, the winter air was brutally sharp. The storm had passed, leaving a canopy of brilliant, cold starlight stretching over the city, reflecting off the icy pavement of the courtyard. The valet brought the car around in silence. The heavy thud of the passenger door closing sounded like a gavel, striking a block of solid oak. Lawrence walked around the hood, the cold biting through his tailored wool coat, and slid into the driver's seat. The engine hummed into life, a low, steady vibration that did nothing to mask the suffocating quiet inside the cabin. He merged onto the avenue. Streetlights began their rhythmic sweep across the dark leather interior, illuminating Clara in brief, golden flashes before plunging her back into the shadows of the passenger seat. Lawrence gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles pulling taut and white against the leather. The questions were stacking up in his chest, heavy and jagged, but his throat refused to open. He glanced at her reflection in the passenger window. She was looking out at the passing city, her posture perfectly relaxed, her hands resting calmly in her lap. The starlight caught the edge of her jaw, painting her not as the simple, unassuming wife he had patronized for years, but as a stranger of immense, untouchable stature. He remembered the morning he had complained about the contract dispute. He remembered telling her she wouldn't understand the complexities of corporate strategy. He remembered her washing her porcelain mug, offering a gentle, agreeable smile, and leaving the room without a word of defense. It had not been the retreat of a woman who did not understand. It had been the limitless patience of a master watching a novice struggle with basic arithmetic. He had mistaken her silence for ignorance. He had mistaken his own loud ambition for power. The drive continued, no radio played, no heater fan disrupted the absolute stillness. Anger was loud. Sadness was loud. Calm meant something had already ended. The silence in the car was not a void waiting to be filled. It was a sprawling architecture she had built around herself, and he possessed no tools to dismantle it. The physical distance between the driver's seat and the passenger door was only a matter of inches. But as Lawrence watched her serene reflection against the freezing winter night, he knew she was sitting on an entirely different continent. Later that night, the estate library remained cloaked in the heavy silence of the early morning hours. Outside the tall windows, the winter wind rattled the barren branches. The fire in the stone hearth had burned down to a faint ember, casting a flickering amber hue across the mahogany furniture. Lawrence sat alone at the massive desk, the weight of the evening pressing on his shoulders. He had not changed out of his tuxedo. He simply stared at the empty space, feeling the undeniable collapse of the world he thought he understood. He reached out and touched the edge of the private ledger near the corner of the desk. It was the leather-bound notebook he had seen Clara holding countless times. He had assumed she used it to keep track of charity event schedules or household deliveries. The profound arrogance of that assumption now tasted like bitter ash. Slowly, he flipped the cover open. The pages were filled with neat, elegant handwriting, structured with flawless precision. There were no social calendars. Instead, he found pages of dense, complex legal analysis. He turned to the most recent entries, his eyes scanning the meticulously organized paragraphs. It was the exact corporate contract dispute he had been complaining about for the past 3 weeks, the case he had explicitly told her she would never be able to comprehend. Lawrence leaned closer. the faint light illuminating her methodical breakdown of the opposing counsel's strategy. Clara had not simply understood the problem. She had dismantled it entirely. She had cited two international trade precedents, cross-referenced them with an obscure maritime law ruling, and woven them together into an airtight defense. He traced the steady curve of her ink, following the brilliant architecture of a victory he could never have designed himself. A wave of shame washed over him, rooting him to the chair. He had paced this very room, delivering patronizing lectures about the harsh realities of the courtroom. All the while, she had sat quietly near the fire, holding the perfect solution in her lap. She had not raised her voice to prove her worth. She had simply let his own ignorance speak for itself, exposing his shallow intellect against her silent mastery. The cruelty of his blindness was measurable now. He had spent years desperate for the approval of men like Judge Sterling, completely oblivious to the fact that he shared a home with one of their most revered minds. The notebook was a mirror reflecting his own profound inadequacy. The creak of the library door broke the heavy stillness. Lawrence turned his head. Clara stepped over the threshold, her movements composed and unhurried. She wore a soft cashmere sweater. In her hands, she carried her familiar porcelain mug, the steam carrying the warm scent of chamomile into the cold room. She did not look triumphant. Her expression carried the steady calm of a woman who knew exactly who she was. She walked slowly toward the center of the room. Lawrence stood up immediately. It was an instinctual display of the respect he should have given her from the beginning. "Clara," he said, his voice stripped of its usual polished confidence. She stopped at the edge of the mahogany desk. Her gaze dropped to the open pages of the leather-bound notebook, taking in the sight of her own handwriting under the lamplight, before lifting to meet his. She offered no immediate comfort, allowing the heavy stillness of the room to hold the space between them. "I was blind," Lawrence said. The admission scraped the back of his throat, costing him the last remnants of his pride. He offered no defensive caveats, no empty excuses. "I treated your silence as an absence of depth. I made you invisible in this house. For that, I am profoundly sorry." Clara let the confession hang in the cold air. She studied the slump of his shoulders, the tension lines framing his mouth, the unvarnished humility replacing his usual polished armor. Forgiveness was not something that could be handed over in a single night. Trust was a house built from the ground up, brick by ordinary brick. Instead of offering a grand absolution, Clara lowered the porcelain mug onto the mahogany desk. The ceramic base clicked against the wood, landing directly beside his scattered corporate files. It was a deliberate placement, anchoring her presence in the very center of his professional world. She drew back the heavy leather chair beside him and took a seat. Lawrence remained standing. He did not presume to hover or crowd her. He waited, a man stripped of his entitlement, needing her unspoken permission to exist in the same airspace. Clara shifted the leather-bound notebook toward the center of the blotter. She smoothed the page to the final clause she had drafted, her index finger resting beside the margin. "The opposing counsel is going to file an injunction by Tuesday," Clara stated, her voice carrying the effortless authority of a woman who had once commanded international courtrooms. "But if you look at the jurisdictional precedent from the Hague Tribunal, their motion is structurally flawed." Lawrence sank into his own chair. He leaned forward, his attention locked entirely on the ink she pointed to, and more importantly, on the formidable woman sitting beside him. "Show me," he asked, his tone stripped entirely of its former arrogance. She began to trace the architecture of the complex strategy without hesitation. The silence inside the library was no longer cold or isolating. It was filled with the steady resonance of a true intellectual equal taking her rightful place. Marriages are rarely saved by grand, extraordinary moments of dramatic surrender. They are rebuilt, if they are rebuilt at all, through the ordinary humble act of finally choosing to listen.